So welcome back for our next session. I'm Lesha Shah. I'm an assistant professor of psychiatry here at NYU. I'm also a member of CUPA, and along with Allison Bateman-House, I'm co-chair of the Pediatric Gene Therapy and Medical Ethics Working Group. I'm really excited for our next panel. I think our slides just maybe are being updated, but as we get that back on the screen, I wanted to just turn it over to each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. So Sandy, we can start with you and just go down the line.
Good afternoon. My name is Sandy Macrae. I'm currently the CEO of Sangamo Therapeutics, which is a genome editing company. I'm a Scottish physician, and I was chief medical officer for a large pharma company for a while, which means I've looked at all the different sides of this complicated question.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Paul Aliu, Global Head for Medical Excellence, Operations and Governance at Novartis Pharmaceuticals. That means a lot, but pretty much I'm in charge of all the kind of peri and post-approval programs, and that includes expanded access, research collaborations, investigator-initiated trials, the whole works. And I think what I'm bringing to this is sort of the global perspective, especially as a company having been involved, I think, the last sort of almost 20 years in this space of compassionate use expanded access and run programs globally for both gene and cell therapies.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rayne Rouce. I am a pediatric oncologist and physician scientist, primarily focused in cell and gene therapies for life-threatening cancers. I am at Texas Children's Hospital and Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. I also lead health equity and community engagement for our Comprehensive Cancer Center and for a number of national scientific organizations where we really focus on advocacy, policy change, and trying to ensure that as we're bringing a lot of these really exciting and novel therapies to the clinic, both in early phase trials, but also as we're looking at commercialization, that we ensure that there's equitable access for all who could potentially benefit.
Hello, my name is Nadia Bodkin. I'm the founder of the Rare Advocacy Movement. I'm also a person living with 3 rare genetic conditions. And the Rare Advocacy Movement is a decentralized organization that has, at the current moment, 400 million members.
Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to our co-moderator, Tim Cripe.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tim Cripe. I'm the Division Chief of Pediatric Hematology Oncology, Blood and Marrow Transplant at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, affiliated with The Ohio State. I'm an academic physician researcher in the cell and gene therapy space. We wanted to start everyone on the sort of the same playing field, just to set the stage about what might be different for cell and gene therapies with respect to expanded access. So I did prepare an 80 slide deck for you, just kidding. 2 slides. One, I think this image that I pulled out of the literature encapsulates cell and gene therapies pretty well in terms of conceptual understanding. On the left, we have in vivo gene therapy. On the right, ex vivo gene therapy, which is what most cell therapies are. In vivo gene therapy, it can be non-viral, viral systems. These are very complex entities to create and produce. They're live biologics. You have to grow them in GMP facilities and test them 1,000 different ways to make sure they're not contaminated, et cetera, and that they have potency. And then they're administered mostly as an off-the-shelf product to patients, whereas ex vivo gene therapy is really where typically cells are collected from a patient, either bone marrow cells or other, modified by gene therapy in the dish, for example, to insert an alternative or artificial receptor in T cells for cancer therapy, and then return to the patient. So in general, those are individualized, require individualized manufacturing, and each product has to undergo some limited testing before it goes back into the patient. So the optics, as it were, or the requirements for both in vivo and ex vivo gene therapy are different from each other and different from most other kinds of therapeutics. So when Lesha and I were talking about this session, we just sort of sat down and said, well, what's different about them or special about cell and gene therapies? And this is sort of just what came down top of mind. And we sort of are going to present these so that our panelists can talk about these and address them as we have our conversation. The first one that came to mind was their high cost, at least up front. One can argue that the cost relative to other therapies over a lifetime may be comparable. They're a one-time administration. In most cases, you don't get a second chance. That's not totally true for CAR Ts necessarily, but certainly with AAV gene transfer, at the moment, that's the case. They may have long-lasting effects, hopefully, that they're a one-time treatment, but also potentially long-lasting side effects. I alluded to the complex handling and monitoring that's required, that might, in some cases, require centers of excellence. The limited availability because of the high technology can be considered living drugs. What happens after administration is not completely understood or controllable. For example, CAR T cells proliferate themselves when they encounter antigens and grow and then contract. So that's not a sort of prescribed thing that you can totally predict. And then there's a limited clinical experience for those intended for rare diseases. So those are just some of the issues that are different about cell and gene therapies that we thought might be addressable with our panel today. So I'm going to turn it back over to Lesha to pose the first question to our group.
Yes, thank you. And so I think with that, we saw a lot of grist for the mill, and this panel is focusing especially on cell and gene therapies. Thank you. And so I think to start off, we might just have each of our panelists share from that list of unique considerations what they see as very important in establishing expanded access programs and some of the unique challenges you've been facing. I can have any of you start. Rayne, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. So I'll start. So from an academic perspective, I'm at a large academic center. I make these therapies in the lab, but I also take care of patients on these therapies. And by definition, pediatric cancers are a rare disease. And so the majority of patients that I take care of are children who typically have not responded or have had their cancer come back after being treated with an upfront chemotherapy, with another clinical trial, for example. And so I mainly create early phase 1 cell therapies that are looking at safety. And of course, later we're looking at efficacy. One of the big challenges is that it does require a very specialized infrastructure, obviously. And so when you're looking at these therapies, and I get patients referred from all over the world, often because we may be the only site that has this specific clinical trial. Of course, we have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, but because we're making these personalized products for patients, our goal is to get that product to the patient. And so some of, I would say all of us have done compassionate use and kind of single patient protocols that take a significant amount of regulatory time and expertise. But because we have already created the product, and typically because the patient does not necessarily have other options, it's very important for us to deliver those therapies. On the other end, I lead our commercial CAR T cell programs. And so we are fortunate in the sense that we have expanded access programs, such as one from Novartis, for example, where if a patient is supposed to get a commercial product, but it doesn't necessarily meet the release criteria, that as opposed to at the beginning where every individual institution would have to file a single IND and do it through their institution and use that pathway, the ability to have an actual expanded access program where we can enroll a patient on that trial and get them through, get the therapy to them as quickly as possible. The cost is a huge thing at all times. I'll say it multiple times, just because when we think about equitable access, also, if I put my health equity hat on, a lot of times we skew that people that have a higher health literacy, and whether they did at the time of diagnosis, at the time they needed to, or whether they were able to meet that bar, like the family that we just heard from, able to advocate for themselves and even have the ability to identify an organization that will help them go to Paris to actually talk to a drug company. 75% of the patients I take care of are on Medicaid. They're children and they're on public health insurance and often don't have that level of ability to navigate the system. And so as I'm writing my clinical trials, but also as I'm receiving referrals and taking care of patients seeking commercial therapies, what I often find is that if you don't have those resources, and if, as they shared, the physician you're seeing is not able to help you, it's so much on the patient and the family to have to navigate this very complex system. And it also is very dependent on the provider that you see, where some people may say, well, there aren't other options, or this is only available for this. I can't think of another pathway. But some may say, you know what, I'm actually going to connect you with this person. I'm going to help you with this. And so when I say the money is an issue, I want to say that we also have the ability to control how we budget the money. So when I'm writing a trial, I'm now writing in for patient navigation. When I'm writing a trial, I'm writing in for these educational resources to help patients through that aspect. Because if I'm budgeting to make a vector, I should budget for that too. And I would a big push to the pharmaceutical companies and those of you in the room to think about how you're able to offset some of the costs from centers with regulatory support and with patient navigation support, because that is often one of the biggest barriers that we face.
Thank you. Go ahead, Nadia.
So I'd like to echo that sentiment because from the rare advocacy movement, we've seen that 95% of the actual rare disease community does not engage in advocacy. And it's because advocacy requires a lot of time, a lot of money, and those are resources that rare disease families do not have an abundance of. So even when it comes to developing these patient navigation programs, a lot of conscious thought has to be placed into it. And the insights can't just come from advocacy, because advocacy is already access is privilege. And there's a bit of a lens that has been developed. So we need to make sure that we go to the actual community where people, those patients and their families that did not know the name of their organization, and there are routes to access these people through the rare advocacy movement now. There's an actual decentralized network that can access them, but you have to budget for it. Their time, there is a fair market value for their time and their expertise. And so you can actually plan for it now.
Can I pick
Yes,
that one up
please. Yeah.
from a couple of ways? So what's the purpose of expanded access? Expanded access is a process that was brought in place to make sure that when you had enough evidence for the benefit and risk of a medicine, the patient would be able to access it while the process went on to have it approved so as it would be available through the proper processes in each country. And that almost always happens at the end of phase 3 in a drug development program. And I think we heard earlier the data that the young woman that was sitting up here said, where she quoted that 75% of the expanded access programs are either 6 months before approval or 6 months after. And that's because you have sufficient evidence to take it to the regulatory authorities, means you've got sufficient evidence that it will benefit patients, which means while the regulatory authorities do their work, and they do a really good job, the FDA does a great job here, that other patients can get access to it while we're waiting for it to be made available through proper channels. And then your insurance or Medicare and Medicaid will pay for it in this country. The problem with cell and gene therapy fitting into that system is that it's intended, the dream is it's intended to be a once and done, whether you're putting an episomal gene in someone's liver to produce hemophilia factor, or you're editing, like in sickle, like we can do. You edit the gene so as they never need they have a sufficient hemoglobin F that they don't sickle in the future. It's a once and done. And that just doesn't fit in that model, because the patients are not just bridging the gap between the evidence and the availability. They're getting the treatment, and that's it, and the treatment's done. And that's why it's best that those patients, those people, because they're people, are part of clinical trials to gather the evidence to convince the authorities as early and as compellingly as possible that the treatment works, so as we can all benefit from it. The second thing about cell and gene therapy is it's incredibly expensive. And it's not just expensive in the end product, which is something that we all talk about. It's expensive to do the clinical trials, expensive to gather that evidence. So for the autologous cell therapy, the CAR T that you mentioned earlier, if you go to one of the contract manufacturers, they'll charge you about $500,000 per patient to manufacture it during the clinical trial process. Now, as the process develops, I'm sure Novartis and their likes has got it down to a much more manageable cost. But during that clinical trial process, it's very expensive. So you have to budget in a company like ours for every patient and think about every patient and how you're going to be able to afford it. And the right thing to do is to make sure that every patient that you afford contributes to the body of evidence that will, as quickly as possible, as compellingly as possible, show that this treatment works and lead to an approval that will lead to benefit for as many as possible. Even AAV gene therapy costs, I know you might spend $2 or $3 million on a batch, and there's a long waiting list for a batch that will do you 10, 20 patients. And I can tell you that we have planned for the next 2, 3 years exactly how much we have made, so as we're ready for each patient as they come. So it's a very different world from that of a small molecule where you'll have a big tub of tablets. And if someone wants some, you have the ability, at least the logistical ability, to give those tablets out. So it has to be managed under a different framework, I think. And then there's one final logistical challenge. I'm Scottish, we're pragmatic, we do Presbyterian Scottish, is we're talking rare diseases. So we have provided cures for hemophilia. There's patients, we work with Pfizer and hemophilia, that are now off factor. There's patients, we've treated 33 patients on Fabry. They're come off ERT, they're happy, they feel that they have a long-term solution. There's patients on sickle. There's 30,000 patients in America waiting for a solution for sickle, which is a dreadful disease, and it's great that people are solving it. But the majority of those diseases are large, rare diseases. Even Fabry has 4,000 patients in America. The majority of rare diseases are small, rare diseases, and that's the problem. So we look on the logistics of this, and once you go much smaller than Fabry, which is, there's 7,000 rare diseases in the liver, of which I think there's about 10 or 20 that are practical for a biotechnology company to work on. That means that there's a large enough patient population, you can do the clinical trial, that you can take it through to registration, and that you will have a market afterwards to pay for all the work that you've done. The majority of rare diseases are very, very small. It's 10, 20 patients in America. People will say there's 100 patients worldwide, but most countries in the world will not be able to access cell and gene therapy. It's just a dream that their healthcare systems will not allow at the moment. So expanded access for them is not the answer. We as a society, as an ecosystem, need to find another answer for this. Academics will like to do it, I am sure. They don't stay around for long enough to follow up the patients. The current regulations say gene therapy, you follow patients for 5 years. For editing, you follow them for 15 years. Most academics don't stay in position for 5 or 15 years and don't have budgets that allow for that. We have put money aside in our company to follow the patients long term. And I know that at Novartis, you feel that same responsibility to do it. So I believe in expanded access when the evidence of benefit and risk is there. I believe it is part of the solution in small molecules and probably in monoclonals as well now. For cell and gene therapy, it's a whole new discussion that has to be had as the first few cell and gene therapies start to get to registration. And the way they get to registration is usually they're acquired or partnered with a company like Novartis, simply because they have the worldwide reach and they have that's the part of the ecosystem that is very good at getting drugs registered and drugs launched. So over to you.
Good segue to Paul.
No, thanks, Sandy. And I mean, so much has been said about this, and maybe kind of to come at least from a, like, at least a big company perspective, or well, from Novartis perspective. One of the things, we've looked at when it comes especially to gene and cell therapies, and I agree with, oh yeah, that's probably better. And I agree with a lot of things like, oh, that's better, that Sandy said, right? We've done a lot of work, and maybe just to credit that with bioethicists in this space, just because we happened to have had, one of the first cell therapies and again, one of the first gene therapies that needed to be kind of commercialized, and have come through the expanded access program with that. And one area we've looked at this when it comes to an expanded access program, we look at it from a 3-part lens, right? Where we say, to actually do an expanded access program at all for cell and gene therapy, it has to be the medically responsible thing to do. It has to be operationally sound, and it has to be ethically resilient. So these are kind of like the 3 pieces that we look at. And kind of not to belabor the point there, medically responsible, I think a lot of that was what Sandy's pointed out. We need to have evidence that shows that the patient will benefit, or at least the benefit risk profile needs to be tilted before you can actually think about giving, a cell or gene therapy to patients, especially. Now, the operationally sound part is huge, and I wouldn't go again into details. I think those are some of the things we've spoken about here. The cost, the actual infrastructure to deploy this. Where can you do this? Centers of excellence in some countries globally, because we've run some of these programs globally, and in some countries there might just be only one center that might be able to do it. And then even from a big company perspective, when you look at the sort of equity, and even when we want to provide equitable access, you might still need to bolster that center even to make that operational, in terms of what type of capability building do you need to do, what type of training, additional training would you need to do. And again, this varies from country to country. And then we talk about the ancillary costs. So even if you provide the gene therapy or you provide the cell therapy, there's so much other healthcare related costs within the system. Who pays for that? And we've had these discussions even at different country levels, where the healthcare system's not prepared to pay, the insurance may not be prepared to pay. And I think one of the things I always want to pull that, because once you go round and round, the discussion always ends back with, well, will the pharmaceutical company pay for this? And I think this is where we need to come back to this, to say, well, if we really want to do this properly, even as a healthcare ecosystem, I think it needs a multi-stakeholder effort. And I think this is one of the pieces that I've always advocated for, even at the country level, be that from a government, from an insurance, from a payer, from a healthcare system, to say, well, should the company even be willing to provide the gene or the cell therapy, then what are other stakeholders in that system prepared to do for the benefit of the patient? So I think I'll stop there, because I think there's so many things that could be said.
I have a question about that. Is it not compelling that if they get the gene therapy, then the kinds of care they might need is presumably much less because they're better off in general?
Well, sure. But then that's a benefit to the healthcare system. So it goes back to just what I'm saying, right? That there's a benefit to the healthcare system. There's a benefit to the payer, as the case may be. And even beyond expanded access, now talking about even the general access and commercialization of these products, a lot of healthcare systems are still not ready for these treatments. And I think that's the sort of elephant in the room, right? Because a lot of healthcare systems or insurance systems are designed for chronic diseases. So you suddenly come with a 1-time or 2-time treatment where it's a 1-time shot, and then the patient may not need treatment or need any other treatment, as the case may be in some cases. And a lot of payer systems still struggle with that. And I think that's even a much bigger issue within the expanded access, well, that sort of spills into the expanded access space when it comes to this therapy.
Or to quantify what you've saved than what you've spent.
Yes.
Yeah. You've told us you've done this quite successfully, though. Your company, 400 cases of expanded access for Zolgensma, for example, a very expensive AAV gene therapy. I assume that's only possible because you are a pretty big company. Can you tell us about that a little bit? The economics, is that totally, do you get any benefit as a company from being so generous? And then maybe Sandy can talk about what the smaller companies the ability to do those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I mean, there's a lot about that program in public domain. So, I won't go into too much detail about that. But, and maybe just to give you a sense, right? I mean, we've probably not published that, but we will at some stage. But over 300 patients have been treated in that program and across 40 plus countries across the world. And actually, the vast majority of patients who got treated were from lower to middle income countries. So again, just to sort of give a sense, right, to your point in terms of what did we learn from that program? I think one of the things we learned was that doing an expanded program for a gene therapy like that, it's difficult. So it's not an easy fit. There's a lot of operational piece. It comes at a high cost. I mean, Sandy kind of alluded to that. The cost of these individual therapies is not cheap. I mean, just the manufacturing process itself, the actual product, it's not like the small molecules that we've dealt with in the past. Now, the other piece is in terms of where you can do that. Which countries can you do it? And even when we go down to the country level, which centers can you do it? What kind of infrastructure do you need to put in place to sort of bolster that? I mean, just to give an example with the Zolgensma piece, one of the things we didn't anticipate was that in some countries, the AAV9 testing would be a challenge. So to make it truly globally equitable, because otherwise, if that became it, like just to give an example, if that was a prerequisite, then you automatically eliminate patients from countries where that's not possible. So one of the things we needed to do was to actually put in a central AAV testing feature as part of the program design, such that we could get the samples, get the patients tested. So that's not a barrier to access to the program. So just, again, just given a very pragmatic example. And then the sort of training that you need to do, right? For most centers, probably in the US, the facilities are there. So you probably just need to deliver the treatment, and then the patient gets the treatment. But in some other countries, the healthcare system or treatments or the patient journey is much more fragmented. So even understanding how those patients navigate the different experts within the healthcare ecosystem, and then thinking, how could we as a company bolster that to ensure that these patients can still get access? So those are just some of the features, right, without going into details there.
But doesn't that demand that we stop talking about expanded access as a homogeneous thing? Because it seems that there are very separate problems that need to be addressed differently. So there is a drug that's got sufficient evidence is going for approval, and in that time before it's approved, let's use the US as the index case, you need expanded access. You need people to get it while they're waiting. That seems very reasonable. There's the second problem that you just started to talk about, which is it's been approved in the US. It's going to take another year or 2 or 3 years to be approved in Saudi Arabia or in Malaysia or wherever. How do we deal with that? Because Novartis, I was GSK, which is a very global company as well, had that problem. How do you deal with the fact that you have obligations in other countries? So those are very different large company issues. Then there's the one about someone's released data. I saw it in the New York Times that says 4 patients have been dosed and it looks really hopeful. Can I get some, please? And that to me is the more challenging expanded access that is kind of compounded with the other two. And the other two are simply logistics, and large companies take them very seriously and deal with them very well. I wonder if in the cell and gene therapy world, where data is released almost patient by patient, that the other one is one that might be worth us talking about.
I wanted to follow up on that. I'm actually curious about the logistics because I feel like I'm less familiar, but I did want to give Nadia a chance to weigh in, because we were speaking a little bit earlier about how patients and patient advocacy communities receive some of that information and what they do with it, particularly for non-trial access and how it's navigated, how it's perceived.
Well, as I listened to this conversation, I wanted to also point out the value behind real world data and how it contributes to the economics of cell and gene therapy and expanded access programs. And so the actual community, the people themselves, reporting back the real world data. And there's a lot of activity in the patient advocacy organizations that support the families in the collection of this data and then dissemination of it. It's something that the pharmaceutical industry and the academic industries can actually leverage to then obtain early access, market access, and commercialization. And that benefits everyone when the therapeutics become available. So that's something that we all have in common, that incentive to bring these therapeutics to the marketplace as quickly as possible and learn from it. And even though it is a one-time or even just 2 times access points with the patients, there's still that follow-up that's repetitive, and there's value in that as well, and the data that's collected when we're tracking post-market surveillance activities.
One thing I'll say, just to point out one of the obvious differences between cell and gene therapy. So again, I'm in the cancer space, but if you look at tisagenlecleucel, the approval was not after large phase 3 trials. You saw evidence of efficacy after, even in the phase 1s and in the phase 2s. And so in that situation, the kind of intent of the patient population who are refractory, patients who don't have access to that therapy typically go on to die. That's just the reality. And so the intention, when you're seeing these, even just 100 patients who had relapsed refractory disease and are not now essentially cured after no other therapy, the way that you think about expanded access can be appropriate in that situation. It's not that you have to, and you didn't have to wait for a large phase 3. So I think that we do have to change the way we think in some ways, because the typical model of saying we need to continue to enroll these patients on a trial may not necessarily be the best way. And I think that when we differentiate between your definition of real world data and how often in academia and in pharmaceutical companies think about real world data, it's a little bit different. But I'll remind that most of these promising therapies started within academic institutions. And we have been running cell and gene therapy trials for a long time and doing follow-up for 15 years. And so what happens is there are patients that, just like that family we talked about, you will miss the window of opportunity. So I don't think we can necessarily prescribe the same model to some of these therapies where the signal of efficacy may be a lot earlier than what we typically think about. And it is about transparency, and it is about full disclosure. So again, I get patients from all over the world who believe that this therapy, that may be investigator-initiated therapy, will be their cure. And I have to remind them, this is a phase 1 therapy. We have only treated this many patients. In this situation, although I know there are not necessarily other treatment options, the risk may outweigh the benefit. So we certainly have to look at individual products and scenarios differently. But I think that because there's precedence, and yes, it's very hard. Yes, we have to deal with the insurance companies. Yes, it's very challenging, but you can grow to get there. So we have to think about that question. Are cell and gene therapies a bit different? Is the typical expanded access model the same? And I absolutely agree with you. These are 3 kind of separate scenarios that I think we have to tackle differently.
I wonder though if we're violently agreeing. If
I'm not violent.
If a medicine is showing compelling evidence in phase 1,
Yeah.
My job is to take it to the agency and show them it and to persuade them to get approval. And so my expanded access trigger is not around a certain phase of development.
Right.
It is around the compellingness of the data and the safety package. So
Yeah.
one of the medicines in my pipeline at the moment, we can stop prion disease.
Right.
So if we inject a virus, it goes to the brain, and mice with prion disease live normal lives. And we're about to we'll file an IND next year and a trial the year after to treat prion disease. 500 people die a year. They die within 12 to 15 months. And I know the first patient that we report, if this works, every mother, father, son, daughter with prion disease will be wanting access to that medicine. And because that's approvable, I believe, within a single phase of development, phase one, because there's no other cure for it. And that's one where we will be working with the agency to get approval early to get it available to as many people as possible. So it's about the evidence rather than the category.
I would just maybe follow up on the importance of having that rigorous evidence and other challenges you might see, particularly in smaller rare diseases where there could be a more intense tension between clinical trial enrollment and those obligations versus those that are seeking access through other pathways.
I mean, I'll just say that most of the therapies that we do at our center are autologous therapies, autologous gene-modified cell therapies that we have created specifically for a patient. And it's not unusual that patient at the time that we created that therapy and collected their blood did meet eligibility criteria. And at the time where the cells are ready for manufacture, they don't, because that's the nature of their diseases. In those situations, as much as we would like to be able to enroll them on the trial, we often do have to seek compassionate use and enroll them on a single patient IND. But I do think that there is a way that being able to continue to collect effective safety and efficacy data on these kind of alternative pathways and still being able to provide the treatment. And within the cell and gene therapy kind of society, scientific society space, we're really interested in being able to do that, where you can still move forward with data collection for these very rare diseases, be able to provide the therapy, but also, even though they are not technically enrolled on the trial, have the same kind of stringent safety and efficacy data gathering metrics. However, it takes a lot of regulatory expertise, it takes a lot of money, and it takes a very similar operation to what you would do on a trial. So often is very challenging to sustain. But I do think it takes a kind of commitment on that level. And I think the companies have some experience with being able to showing how you can effectively still gather data that may be helpful. So I'll maybe.
Yeah, no, thanks for, I mean, you just a nice segue into that, because I was just going to say, for our cell therapy, it was I mean, you're right, because as you probably know, a lot of centers were having to do single patient INDs, and we then thought, well, how do we ease the burden of sites and centers? And we then set up a program and actually collect data. But it then took a very proactive discussion with the agency, which we're very open to, actually. And that adds to the body of evidence, actually, on the treatment. So, you know, to your point, I agree that this is something that needs to be done more so. And that also ties in for us for the sort of like 15-year type follow-up that's required, where even for our gene therapies right now, whether the patient's accessing that via trial, via expanded access, we then subsequently actually enroll them into the registry so that we can actually collect long-term data. So that's becoming sort of more sort of standard, because that then you get like long-term safety, and also you sort of, you know, get the efficacy data. And way beyond even gene and cell therapies, one of the things we have done even as a company, and I know a lot of other companies are doing that, is to systematically collect data from expanded access programs. I think we need to move away from, oh, we just treat the patients and then we don't know what happens, to say, well, how do we systematically actually collect data from these patients? And then if we collect the data, what can we do with the data, whether that be informing about safety, whether that be informing about efficacy. I mean, it's now kind of 2 years, I think, where we actually have an expanded access program where we were not even running a trial because it was for an additional indication in a rare disease. But we then actually went back and collected data retrospectively, which then we used for discussion with the agency. And that actually was the data that got the approval in that rare disease. So just, to your question, the collection of data is absolutely essential. I don't think it's a nice to have. I think it's a must have moving forward.
In fact, the FDA obligates you to, as you said, 5 or 15 years, depending on what the product is. But is there any direction about how much data you need and who decides that?
Enough. and nobody knows. And why do we do it? We do it because these are very new products, and they are changing your genome irrevocably. And therefore, the right thing to do is to follow. We follow, if we launch a new antihypertensive, we follow it forever. And you file PSURs for the rest of its life. And so we're not really doing anything different, other than the patients feel they're better and walk away and don't take the tablets and therefore don't make reports on it. But you could imagine a situation 20 years hence where somebody has colon cancer and who had one of my therapies. How do you know if this is anything to do with my therapy or not? You don't, unless you've looked at data from a lot of people who got the therapy and know that it's the normal rate of colon cancer.
I mean, it's exactly what we're experiencing right now with these new T-cell malignancies occurring in people who've gotten gene-modified cell therapies. And a lot of that data is from real-world data after commercialization, but also from people enrolled on expanded access protocols as well as on clinical trials. And because you have to continue to capture that data. So in some ways, as much as it seems as if it may be a burden to have to follow someone for 5, 10, 15 years, it actually has opened some doors for us to be able to gather important safety and efficacy data that I think has really benefited patients.
I want to pick up on something else you said about cancer. And I think if as a cancer patient, you've just had this shocking diagnosis and you'll do everything to change your future. We deal very often with genetic diseases, so Fabry disease, for example, and that's quite a different community. They are very, they know each other, they support each other, they go through this together. When you go and introduce a new medicine to them, it has to have the approval of the community rather than just an individual before they will embrace it. And it means that they do remarkable things. And one of the, we talk about you should be encouraged to go into the clinical trial. When you start a clinical trial on a rare disease, you're given a kind of dose escalation plan by the agency. And the first dose is rarely the most effective dose because you start there to show that the medicine is safe and then gradually increase. And some of the patient communities talk about this as the hero dose. So someone's got to take the first dose. Someone knows that they're not going to benefit from it. They know that they won't be able to be dosed again because they'll develop antibodies to the AAV, but they feel for their community of Fabry patients or whatever disease that this is the right thing to do. And that's just like a remarkable moment in humanity that people will do that for other people. And I believe that that spirit of doing things for other people is there to be embraced and tapped into. So as when we are talking about people that don't want to go into the trial, we need to spend more time explaining to them why going into the trial has benefit and working with them to show them the benefit they will give to others in the same condition.
Yeah, I also think I absolutely appreciate that, but I also think that one of the glaring issues is that a lot of people do have distrust of clinical trials. A lot of people think about historical things that were not that long ago. And so in the same way that we can talk about communities that we may say the Fabry community is like this community is like, obviously there's heterogeneity within all communities. But when you think about racial and ethnic minorities, when you think about people who are of lower socioeconomic status, when you think about people who geographically are not in a place where they have access to a large academic medical center, when you think about people who don't have broadband to be able to access the web page where the Fabry community works, there's a huge pocket of people who do not have access to clinical trials, period, for a number of reasons, a lot of them logistical and socioeconomic. So yes, I am a clinical trialist. Yes, I believe in clinical trials. Yes, I believe in talking about the benefit, but that person in front of you is thinking about their benefit and thinking about what it will do for them and thinking about their disease. So in some ways, I think we can't impress upon them, you have to do this for the good of, because I think we have to say, there has to be a area between your financial model and your ability to get this to market and our ability to want to get these therapies to patients when we know that they can benefit them. And so I do, most advocacy boards, most people that are advocating on behalf of a disease are people that do have means, do have the ability to do that often full time, often have high health literacy, and it's not necessarily representative. So in those situations, I do think that we still have to recognize that spiel of do this for the benefit of all of those around you may not necessarily be what can draw someone in. And in some cases, there may be a reason that someone is not able to access that trial. If you say on this trial, you will have to come back 3 times a week for pharmacokinetics, but if you do this, you'll come back once a week, that can be a deciding factor. And so I push all of us, me as someone who's writing clinical trials, but those of us in the room in pharmaceutical companies to think about those additional barriers that are beyond not wanting to be on the lowest dose level and perhaps not having the benefit, because when we're talking about it, we're full disclosure and saying we're not sure if this works. So I just wanted to point that out.
That's a great point. And that's why it's really important to recognize the difference between the advocacy landscape and the community-based landscape. They're 2 completely different ecosystems and they have different incentives. They operate differently, communicate differently, and it's really important to know the difference between the 2 before creating your plan.
Maybe quick comment on, because again, just to take that one level higher, not just the US, look at it from a global lens. And that's interesting because, what you just said, both said, has triggered that. Because when I look at, for example, the Zolgensma program, one of the things that was like an aha moment for us was actually how the prevalence of the disease was not well characterized in some countries. So it actually took a global expanded access program in some countries, even not just for us, but even at a country level, for them to realize the sort of extent of, like the disease within the country. That was one. And then there were countries, so you, again, talking about like the advocacy, right? When you look at Europe, you look at the US, and a lot of sort of, kind of Western high-income countries, where there are well-developed patient groups or advocacy groups, the minute you move to certain other geographies, it's non-existent. And actually, one of the interesting things was that the countries where there seemed to be more patients were actually the ones that didn't have that. So one of the other things that's come out of the program was actually how we connected some of those countries to patient groups in sort of developed countries to actually help to set up that support system. So that sort of ecosystem, I think it's also, again, just my thinking that, yeah, while we need to look at it from a country perspective, it's also important to have a global lens to it because there's a much bigger problem. And when we start to go into diseases like sickle cell, for example, which I know like this is the kind of like the next frontier when it comes to like the gene therapy, the bigger burden of sickle cell disease is not in the US, So I think the companies coming with those products really have to think about how do you address that? In communities of color in particular. I was just talking, I just use myself as a case example. I think my wife is one of 5, and she lost 3 siblings to sickle cell. And across the family, there's, I think, 4 sickle cell sufferers that I know who have crises on a regular basis. So again, just sort of bring that like personal. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at as companies sort of think about, not just companies, but again, like patient groups, right? To say, well, if we're looking at this disease, let's not just look at it through our local lens. How can we also look at this through a global lens?
That's actually what we've been looking at the rare advocacy movement. And one of the solutions that is now being worked on through the health equity diagnostic infrastructure is to create one of the first global centers of excellence for rare diseases that's based in South Africa. And so there's a lot going into that infrastructure to allow for cell and gene therapy trials and things of that nature. But it's being done on a community-based level because that's the majority of the global environment. And we have to recognize that because we kind of end up being facing a silo while we're, going to these events. We look around and they really all speak similar language. And we forget that the majority of the world works completely differently and speaks differently.
So we have 15 minutes left in our session, so it's time to open it up to audience questions and online questions. So please come down to the microphone and lay it on us. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much. This is a great panel. My name is Carolyn Chapman. I am with the MRCT Center of Brigham and Women's and Harvard. And I wanted to go back to an earlier point, Sandy, that you were making about how there's commercial reasons for, limiting the clinical trial and trying to figure out the best patients that are going to get you to, get to approval as quickly as you can with the intended benefit of the population at large. But something that's come up for me lately is, when you determine the eligibility for clinical trials, like the inclusion, exclusion criteria, the risk benefits for a company clearly are going to be different than the risk benefits from the patient perspective. And as Rayne was saying, even within that patient perspective, you may have folks with very different risk benefit analyses of any given trial. So I was just wondering if we could think a little bit about how our own unique perspectives, and this came up a little bit at the end, can influence those determinations about eligibility criteria in the first place, which would then kick it into you're included or you're not included. And of course, the regulators might also have their perspectives as well.
So this isn't just my reflections as running a genomic medicine company. I used to be a chief medical officer. When you run a trial, you have to balance a pure population that will maximize your chance of success, registration, or a wide population that will ensure the most number of people will be able to take the medicine when it's approved. If you go too wide, you end up with a trial with data that doesn't always come out as statistically significant and fails and nobody gets it. And you go too narrow and you find that there are 3 people in New York that are eligible and nobody else in the world. And that is the hardest thing about drug development, is making that choice between narrow and wide. And usually what you do is you make sure you get approval on a narrow population, and then I'm sure you have people that expand this and then do follow on in 3B and 4 studies to get you there. And it's a balance. Clinical trials are phenomenally expensive. A phase 3 trial for rare diseases is about $100 million. That's just to get approval. And that will be a relatively narrow label, as we would call it. And then you have to expand beyond that. It is true that the trial population that you get reflects those people that have access to trial centers and is not fully representative of the final population. But that's not just men and women, and it's not just people of different racial backgrounds. It's simple things like, I was talking to the woman from Biomarin earlier, that you set exclusion for height and weight, and the mg per kg that the average person in the trial get may not be representative of those people that take it in the real world. In a trial, you assume that someone takes it every day on demand, and you know exactly who takes their tablets every day. And so the trial populations are not truly representative. but a drug that is good enough will cope with that. So if the drug truly is a medicine worth having, it will cope with that not quite representativeness.
I will say though that there are very simple things that we can do to not make sure our criteria is overly restrictive without basis. We all know that there are lots of kind of boilerplate inclusion exclusion criteria that get placed in clinical trials without a true scientific rationale. I have looked at multiple numbers of my trials and said, why did I include that? Has to be less than this. And people say, well, that's what we always do. So I do think things like that. BMI is not representative of a BMI in many countries and in America, and it's based on a very different body type than an African-American, for example. So there are lots of things, though, I do think that as we think about knowing that we may be selecting for a population that is not necessarily as diverse as the disease representation is, ensuring that we have a true scientific rationale for every exclusion criteria that we have, because I think that doing that and being intentional about it and rethinking it on every iteration is kind of a happy medium that we can at least take, because and not overtly exclude people for rationale that does not necessarily make sense.
Yeah, and I would encourage the investment in market research and actually making sure that market research is actually truly diverse and doesn't just sample the advocacy partners' constituents, because there's a lot more information that's being missed out on this preliminary market research that's then informing these protocols. So it's important to make sure that the market research departments and people that are creating those studies and the interviews, the discussion guides and the recruitment are actually being reported on and checked in on.
Rafael?
Hi, thanks. I just want, Rafael Escandon, Seattle, member of the PGTME here at NYU. Thank you, Tim and Lesha, for moderating this session and for all the participants today. I have a comment and then sort of a variation on a question I asked earlier. The comment is, would the panel agree that there's maybe a need, or that cell and gene therapies, and I put gene therapies into the very, very big bucket of gene edits, gene replacement, gene modulation, silencing, et cetera. Is there a good reason to at least distinguish small molecules and biologics specifically, even as it goes to expanded access, from gene therapies, these more complex products that the session's been talking about today? So that's sort of the comment or the question, or I mean, that's the question. The comment is, personally, I believe I believe that the typical historic drug development rubric has imposed expectations, and both regulatory expectations that those of us who develop gene therapies have to spend a lot of time sometimes educating our own regulators about some of the differences. But I feel like, is the traditional rubric helping us or hurting us?
I'll say again, the burden of proof has to be higher for something that goes into your body and changes it forever. It has to be higher. And we allow expanded access for small molecules because as it goes through the regulatory process, if the regulators say they don't like it, or they show data that says it causes problems, you can stop taking it. Whereas if you've taken a cell, particularly an AAV or an editing technology that has done something permanent to your genome, if something is found out later during that regulatory process where everything is revealed, it's too late for you to change that. And so I truly believe that we should have a higher standard for this. These medicines are fantastic. Patients with Fabry disease come up to us at congresses and say, my life has been changed. I can go to work, I can walk again, it's fantastic. And it makes the people in my company so enthusiastic about making this medicine available that you almost have to rein it in because it could make such a difference. It will come in time, and when it comes, it will make a difference, but we need to do this prudently and carefully.
And I would agree with
I
that.
take that as a yes.
Yes, no, and I would agree with that. I mean, the other element, just to Sandy's point, is when trials are done in cell and gene therapies, they're usually very small population. So it's not, like we do cardiovascular trials in 30,000 patients. So when you open up an expanded access program in somewhere like that, you fairly have a big handle in terms of the safety and efficacy data. But when you look at a lot of the cell and gene therapies, in some cases, there's like less than 10 patients actually in some of the pivotal trials. So I think it's important. And the other aspect of that is for a lot of gene therapies right now, because of just, the rare diseases that are targeted, they're going into children, right? So these are kids that still have years and years and years of their lives ahead of them. So the more reason why there needs to be some caution just to ensure that we're really comfortable with the safety and the efficacy and not rushing into it with some naivety.
One plug for children. The children that I treat typically haven't had 3 MIs and smoked a pack per day for 10 years. So as cautious as we have to be when we look at the mechanism of action of the way cell and gene therapies work, that's very different than a small molecule or other biologics. And so this rationale of restricting access because children, the way that they filter, the way that their body works, the rationale is not quite the same. So we have to be very careful about restricting access to these usually healthier populations who have a lot to gain. And so I think, just to your point, it's a whole nother example of how the rubric that's designed has to be modified a bit to meet the standard.
Call on me. I have a question from our virtual audience. Someone says, with all the realism that Sandy is injecting into this panel conversation, would he agree that wherever the evidence, the economics, the logistics, and the approval velocity allows, expanded access should be considered, even if it will be rare?
Given all the challenges that you've talked about, do you agree that expanded access should still always be considered, even if it turns out to be a rare occasion?
Always, particularly as the evidence is gathered and the medicine is shown to be safe and effective. As you get closer to registration, that's when the economics of it allows you to invest in that.
Thank you. And I have one more question. Sorry, Lisa. Some companies state on their websites that they will not give access to their investigational gene therapy products, for example, for hemophilia and Duchenne, due to the uncertainty surrounding them. What, if anything, do you think would make sponsors willing to give access to an unapproved gene therapy via expanded access?
Compelling efficacy and safety. It's the only way. And at that point, if the evidence is compelling, we'll be talking to the FDA and trying to get registration. At that point, the medicine will be available.
Lisa?
This will be very quick. I think that you all should have been on the panel this morning to make the business case and the ethics case against providing expanded access. And I just wanted to ask about what Paul and Sandy, just one more factor, which is something that we bring up a lot, which is the fact, as Sandy called it, once and done, very limited populations. So expanded access, when you give that out, you're really closing off a future customer, if you want to put it very crassly. But I mean, if you factor that in as well, in addition to all the other things, it seems that you could make a pretty solid case for just not doing it in patients' best interests. Of course, I may get drummed out of CUPA, but
maybe just to start, and Sandy, please feel free to weigh in. I mean, yes and no, because in some ways, right, yes, you treat that particular patient, but that particular disease doesn't go away in the population, right? So, I mean, SMA as a classic example, there will be babies that would keep getting born. I think the beauty of medicine and science and research is the fact that there's a treatment that in the future, for babies that are born, we know that actually their fate might be different from the same baby being born 20 years ago. So in some ways, to your point, in terms of, even though it's one time and done, I don't think that in itself necessarily advocates against treating them by expanded access. But then that also becomes different depending on the company size, the infrastructure in place, and so many other factors. So I think there's a lot of contextual factors that come into play, but just, I think simply from my perspective, that's not necessarily a case against doing expanded access.
I can't imagine what it must be like to be the parent of a child like we heard today, so eloquently from those parents, and believe that you read something or saw something, that there was a cure out there, that why aren't they giving it to me? I know that the Daily Mail doesn't necessarily talk about the toxicology and the long-term follow-up and all those other things, and gives hope where there isn't yet hope. And I think we have a responsibility as a community, doctors, advocates, pharma and biotech company, all of us have a responsibility to tell these stories well, not to give undue hope, but to lay a path forward that gives patients and parents and children hope that there is a solution on its way for many of these diseases. It might not be my son that benefits from it, but it could be his son or daughter. And that's hard, but this is a hard thing that we're trying to do.
We
Also
are
think-
out of time.
Just really quickly, I think that it's, I think this moves to the point of there being an intermediary between a company and between the patient. As a physician, I can say to my patient who has seen this news late breaking report, I can help put the data in context as they're talking about seeking that therapy. And as someone who works in the community and someone who works with advocacy, I do think if we work together, putting the data in context so people understand the risk benefit and then thinking about it in that way, rather than it being, because we all have our kind of agendas in some ways, I think is the best thing we can do for patients and families who see that hope, but may not necessarily have all of the information.
We hope that leaves you all with some hope and optimism. Thank you all panelists. Thank you, Lesha.